when the Bengal province experienced a famine, experienced a drought followed by a famine in 1770 under the command of Warren Hastings, the Governor General commissioned a granary as a potential respite from future famines. And it is this granary that you see in this image here. Built in Patna in 1789, John Garstin designed the structure known as the Golghar, which means roundhouse. 2 staircases, gracefully and symmetrically. You can kind of see both of them in this image, one here and one here. Gracefully and symmetrically spiral up this large building. Laborers, like a chain of ants, were to carry sacks of wheat up one of these staircases, pour the grain in through a puncture at the top, and then descend down the other staircase. As you may have immediately noticed, the building resembles a stupa, and it was inspired by one, specifically the Sanchi stupa from the 3rd century BCE, whose form has been a lasting signifier of Indianness. Yet their likeness extends only to the fact that both buildings were meant to encase something. The stupa, a relic of the Buddha, and the granary, wheat. In other ways, the Golghar is very different from a stupa. You circumambulate a stupa in prayer, while you scale the Golghar as labor. And while you look at a stupa, you actually climb the Golghar so that you can turn around and look back at the city from where you came. In fact, today, for exactly that reason, it retains its only function, which is that of a popular tourist spot in Patna. The building you see was never put to use as a granary. The project had been plagued by many design flaws. The stairs were too steep, the doors opened inwards in error, and these reasons were usually cited as to why the building had failed. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if it had been expedient to abandon a whole building rather than just change the hinges on a door. That is to rectify its errors. Certainly, I was not the first to realize that the problems faced by the structure extended further than just its design failures. One possibility is that Hastings may have built the granary, but he hadn't been able to procure the grain with which to fill it. Travel writer Francis Buchanan encountered the roundhouse in 1811 and described it thus. At the western extremities of the suburbs is a building called the Golghar, intended as a granary and perfectly sui generis. For the sake of the great man by whose orders this building was erected, the inscription should be removed, were it not a beacon to warn governors of the necessity of studying political economy, and were it not of use to mankind to know even the weakness of Mr. Hastings. So what was this political economy that Hastings misread or ignored? What had caused the famine to which the province lost 1/3 of its population in starvation? In the previous decades, the East India Company had made inroads into the Indian, what we now call South Asian, subcontinent, and in the process raised taxes, forced agriculturalists to shift from food crops like rice and lentils to cash crops like cotton and indigo, and channeled revenue from the provinces into the coffers of the company. This process denuded the countryside of the few buffers against the effects of drought. Now, it was not that famines had eluded non-British rulers, but the scale of the one under Hastings in 1770 was unprecedented. It had caused about 10 million deaths. It would be 3/4 of a century before the anti-colonial movement would coalesce, when liberal-trained Indians would begin to articulate theories of colonialism as an economic drain. Later critiques of economic exploitation would shape the political imagination of the freedom movement and filter into the founding tenets of the nation-state. It would influence the choices made in the early years of independence to borrow the Soviet and Chinese model of planning and targeted resource allocation. In my talk today, I will critically explore these early years of the nation-state, years that also came on the heels of a famine. The Bengal Famine of 1942. So this famine was caused by a cyclone, and it marked the last years of British rule in India. So the cyclone came up through here and went up and kind of caused devastation in Bengal, which is this pink area that you see here. And the granary that I just showed you is in Patna, right here. It was particular in that rural peasants starved while food was diverted to urban centers to support colonial industries. A combination of the lack of will and weak distribution systems maintained the rural-urban imbalance, forcing the then government to rethink the economic strategy regarding food grains, although a little too late for the victims of the famine. They set in place a system of price controls, anti-hoarding, surplus redistribution, and rationing to bolster availability when food shortages occurred during World War II. The Punjab, the fertile irrigated land of 5 rivers, which is right here, this bow tie shaped place is Punjab. It means the land of 5 rivers, produced the surpluses, the excess that bolstered the updated systems of food management. Economists and politicians later theorized India as in a battle against scarcity. The country was a risky experiment in democracy, which most outsiders had predicted would fail, especially after the violent partition of India and Pakistan. So here's the Radcliffe line dividing India and Pakistan. The first decade saw constant crop failure and food shortage, and the country was highly dependent on foreign aid. These factors justified the choice to retain the wartime framework of food control even after World War II had ended. For the indigent, that is the deficient state, the region of Punjab, now bisected into east and west, and you can see it was really just cut into half, was a critical source of surplus grain. In the next part of this talk, I will discuss how investing in the ecology, architecture, and urbanism of Punjab became an important aspect of India's food project and of its process of decolonization. In these early years, the country was in flux. It was shaping both its political economy and its built environment, and the attempt was for the two of them to be in sync with each other, that is, to not make the mistake that Hastings made. I will look at 3 facets of large projects in Punjab, which highlight the coincidences and conflicts between political economy and design, the damming and management of the Satluj River, the involvement of the state in the city of Chandigarh, and the effect of Chandigarh on the schools of agriculture in East Punjab. Through these projects, I will outline how an economics of scarcity, not just in food grains, but also in building materials, defined modernism and modernization in India. Although Punjab was conceived of as a place of excess, you can see the 5 rivers right here, these 5, and the line dividing them. So although Punjab was conceived of as a place of excess, it was still wrought from the surrounding scarcity, and the architecture of Punjab became entangled in this long and arduous process of decolonization. Decolonization can be thought of as the process through which a nation achieves self-determination, that is, economic and political freedom on one hand, and the ability to produce its own society and culture on the other. For Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, the path to self-determination followed a technological logic that went thus. If we industrialize agriculture, we can create the conditions in which our subjects, in this case, of course, peasantry, can decolonize. Selfhood was to be achieved through a rigorous pursuit of techno-modernity. A critique of this logic later became the cornerstone of post-colonial thought, that is, the pluralism of the people versus the singular logic of a totalizing state. But for Nehru, damming the river Satluj was an essential component in the long process of modernizing agriculture and decolonizing the country. At the dedication of the Bhakra Dam, he famously proclaimed, and this is from the Indian National Congress's archive, the Bhakra Nangal is something tremendous, something stupendous, something which shakes you up when you see it. Bhakra, the new temple of resurgent India, is a symbol of India's progress. New temple of resurgent India. This phrase has been popularly understood as Nehru's attempt to shift India's focus from the religious to the secular and signal the ascendance of science over superstition. But a more sinister counter-reading of this statement is possible. We could read it as Nehru telling India to worship at the dam. The dam in this turn of phrase is turned into a techno-aesthetic god, and it is at its feet that we pray. This is, of course, not a generous interpretation and probably not what Nehru meant. But through this unintended second meaning, I believe he inadvertently implied the dam's function as being in excess of its infrastructural nature. It was also an ideological and mythological thing, a transitional object meant to catalyze healing after centuries of colonial pillaging and the tragedy of violent partition. Public intellectual and psychoanalyst Ashish Nandi has argued that the Big Dam was a psychotherapeutic intervention into the selfhood of the nation state. It was the necessary public work through which the state actualized itself and made itself visible to the public. The barrage was an iconic object that embodied and materialized the desire of the state and the state's vision of itself. Any critique of the dam was a critique of, was an attack on the process of self-determination, and these high stakes rendered any form of critique impossible. The Bhakra Dam, a singular structure, this is the Bhakra Dam, became an icon of the water management, of the entire water management on the river Satluj. And you can sort of begin to see the entire project here. There's this feeder, there's the Ropar headworks here, Gobind Sagar, which is also behind the Bhakra Dam, the Nangal headworks. So this is a large project, but it was this dam that became the icon of this entire project. And of India's entire effort of public works and planning. But simultaneously, the Bhakra Nangal river management system was a part of an extensive canal and dam system already present throughout Punjab. At independence, the Indus Basin was a highly managed ecological environment. One could argue that the manipulation of the valley, its beginning as an infrastructural ecology, began 5,000 years ago with the cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. The frenzied process of colonial canal building, however, began in the 1850s. And although slow to accelerate, it rendered the land irrigated and fertile, but also one with multiple claims to the water it supplied. Until the Punjab was unified, well, first bisected and then unified, and then consolidated by independence, these water claims played a part in keeping the major projects like the Bhakra Nangal shelved. These are the 5 rivers of the Punjab. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which all come together and form the Indus here. And this is the list of all the different canals and works on the Punjab, in the Punjab itself. When first proposed in 1908, the Bhakra Nangal project, first proposed in 1908, the cost was prohibitively expensive. Later proposals were tabled. However, claim over the water by the lower region of the Sindh stymied them. So if you see here, here's the 5 rivers that come together into the Indus, and this is the Sindh right here, the Sindh. And so it's only after independence that the Sindh was given over to Pakistan that India could start to dam this region here, because otherwise the Sindh, the princely kingdoms in the Sindh put up a resistance to the dam. It was only after partition that the project was resurrected and updated with updated hydropower components and redesigned on the basis of a World Bank report in 1954. Part of the story is that Pakistan received the lion's share of the irrigated and canalized parts of the Punjab, as you can imagine that, right? Because look at how much of the river ended up there and how much of it ended up here. Another part of the story is the 12-year-long dispute over the water of the Indus. Because even though Pakistan had the rivers, India had the beginnings of them, So, over the 12-year-long dispute over the water of the Indus and its tributaries between India and Pakistan, these narratives of water scarcity contributed to the decision to go ahead with a mega project. So this is for something else. With the mega project on the Satluj in Punjab, right near the border of Pakistan. The point I want to press here is that it takes a centralized state to initiate a proposal with a complex and problematic history and then go ahead and build it. Thus, we begin to see a tension emerging between the totalizing tendency of the state and the complexity of water management in the Indus Basin. The state built a singular mega project for the benefit of the totality of its people, yet claims to the water of the river were numerous and conflicting, and the benefits of the project were hard to quantify. The numerous irrigation canals, the bunds, the messy history of through which water rights developed all stood in contrast to the state's public works project, which then emerged as the primary symbol of the nation as bountiful, producer of excess, supplier of plenty, a symbol that could be made into a stamp. And again, you saw what a complex project it was, but this is the stamp that gets sent out for it. That could be made into a stamp and circulated throughout the country, whether or not the benefits of the project on the stamp were as easily distributable. The icon circulates where the grain cannot. Nehru loved the Bhakra Dam and he saw it as a foundational icon of the nation state. When Le Corbusier visited India, to design and build the city of Chandigarh, Nehru arranged for him to visit the Bhakra Dam. Early in the 1950s, Nehru had asked Corbusier to propose an aesthetic plan for the Bhakra, but Corbusier, being the modernist he was, insisted that the structure was powerful on its own, that a modern aesthetic came from the dam itself. It had no need to be separately aestheticized. Later, so Corbusier actually did make a proposal for a museum and a recreation center. And he proposed that a copy, and he also made a proposal for a railing, which is from a sketch of which I found in the archive today morning. So that's the railing right there, and that's the dam. And with a little light in there. So later he proposed that a copy of his open hand sculpture be built atop the dam. And I mean, there's a really wonderful drawing of this in the next room right there. This is like phenomenally huge and amazing, and you should go see it and ignore this one. Crowning it with the symbolism that Corbusier hoped it would bring to the city of Chandigarh, of being open to new ideas and distant from the past, facing forward to the future in the bold hope of embracing whatever is to come. For Corbusier, the hand symbolically extended the greater function of the dam to unify and provide. Yet both river and dam were not easy signifiers of political and economic harmony. The river was the subject of great dispute between Punjab and the Sindh, between India and Pakistan, and the dam, conceived in the colonial crucible, was born from the violence of partition. In fact, in the 1970s, as political tensions in Punjab changed, the hand became a joke among architects in Chandigarh as a hand that stopped the flow of the water from the Bhakra. And so Corbusier's solid symbol, more so in its absence, because it wasn't built for a long time, became a sort of allegory of the messy politics of decolonization and scarcity. The dam is equidistant from both Ludhiana and Chandigarh in geography, and in both geography and in function. So here we have the Bhakra Dam, we have Ludhiana right here, there, and Chandigarh right here. So there's a bit of a triangle. All three sites were meant to be harbingers of the future, important catalysts to help unfetter the country from its past. They were vehicles through which modernity could be possibly achieved, and also ideological and aesthetic icons of what modernity meant and what it looked like. While Chandigarh and the Bhakra Nangal were new projects, Ludhiana was an old city set to absorb new functions. An early candidate for the role of the capital, the city instead became central to the region's industrial and grain economy. In the early 1950s, a new agricultural university was proposed here to take over the functions of the Layalpur Agricultural University, lost to Pakistan in the partition, along with the region's old capital, Lahore. The university, which took some time to come into fruition, was the site for modern research and development, a place from which agriculture would transform into its industrial potential. Chandigarh, on the other hand, was the nerve center to Ludhiana's marketplace. It was the administrative point from which crucial resources like water would be distributed and decisions be made, food grain administered. For these reasons, this capital city was to embody and manifest the somewhat contradictory nature of any nation state. It had to risk having a political imagination, and at the same time, it had to function with precise bureaucratic efficiency. In describing this, Nehru proclaimed, "Let this be an open city, unfettered with tradition from the past and a symbol of the nation's faith in the future." This was a compelling reason to design a brand new city rather than attach an administrative sector to a town such as Ludhiana. The site chosen for Chandigarh was roughly central to the trilingual area of Punjab that we now know as the three states of Haryana, Punjab, and Himachal Pradesh. The site was a proverbial tabula rasa, a piece of virgin territory chosen through aerial reconnaissance at the foothills of the Shivalik, unattached to any other city. Of course, as we are well aware, the tabula rasa is a concept, not a real thing. There is no such thing as a tabula rasa any more than there is a utopia, and this site was no different. It housed about 6,000 villagers and their farmlands from whom the land was acquired. The process of acquisition was not all smooth. Norma Evanson, one of the earliest historians of Chandigarh, relates an anecdote, one that she herself glosses over, in which a particular village refused to give up their land. They insisted that this land was their legacy, and they would not give it up unless they were violently killed for it. They would rather die than forfeit. The battle over eminent domain raged on, with neither side relenting. Eventually, a peculiar solution was arrived upon, which seemed somewhat adequate. The villagers agreed to leave their land if the governor made a public statement that he were willing to take their lives for it. Thus, in a strange drama, the governor, on behalf of the state, agreed to kill the villagers should they not leave the land. That is, he publicly promised, didn't threaten, promised to perform an extrajudicial violence. And the performance of the promise abated the need for real violence. On the surface, this theatrical violence seems to have protected the villagers from real violence. Yet I would contend that this piece of theater did the opposite. The enactment of semantic killing only further secured the state's grasp over violence as a mode of action. It is not so much that in the process of acquiring and citing Chandigarh, the state perpetrated violence, because it did not. Rather, it revealed itself as the ultimate guardian of violence, which it wielded over democratic process in the battle against its dissenting subjects. And so Chandigarh was able to find its tabula rasa, Nehru's place, unfettered by tradition of the past. Yet the Prime Minister was certainly aware that the site was not unoccupied, that it was not a bare patch of uninhabited land, that villages populated the place. If this were the case, then what did it mean to Nehru to conceive of this place as a clean slate? What exactly was meant by new city? To understand this is to understand Nehru's idea of modernity. For him, to be modern was to be engaged, to take nothing for granted, rather to bring one's mind to the table, to the problem at hand, to the experience that one was confronted with. This was not an ahistorical view. Rather, you need to rethink the way you saw the past as well. Nehru's modernity demanded that the mind be put in a situation where it disengages from the past and can thus imagine a radically different future. Thus, it was never a question of whether the site of Chandigarh was inhabited or not. It was a question of allowing the architects, whichever were chosen, to bring a disinterested mind to the site. The mind is the clean slate, not the site. It was about allowing citizens to come to the project with open minds. This notion of modernity reveals itself in Nehru's defense of the city to the Indian Institute of Engineers, where he said, "It is totally immaterial whether you like it or not. It is the biggest thing in India of its kind. That is why I welcome it. It is the biggest thing because it hits you on the head and makes you think. You may squirm at the impact, but it makes you think and imbibe new ideas. And the one thing that India requires in so many fields is to be hit on the head so that you may think." For Nehru, Chandigarh was meant to force the mind to be modern. It was meant to engage in the arduous task of making its inhabitants rethink their worldview. Architecture was a tool through which humans could potentially be transformed and decolonized. The native could be lured into modernity: light, ventilation, sunshades, footpaths, pedestrian pathways, zebra crossings, green zones, wide roads. All of these elements were to align in the master plan and guide the malleable mind into the realm of modernity. Although it seems like Corbusier, Jeanneret, Fry, Drew, and Nehru would have been in accord as to what modern meant in India, their modernity was nuanced and differentiated, not only between the architects themselves, but also with that of their patrons. Take, for example, Corbusier. His modernism displayed a strong desire to connect to the rural and draw from the countryside so that he could refine and instrumentalize a primitive aesthetic. In fact, when designing the Capitol complex, Corbusier quietly preserved one village on the hills in the background. The village functioned as, and the village is right there. And actually, there are quite a few drawings here where you can see the way in which that village was preserved in the exhibition. The village functioned as a signifier of rural life, keeping the city in close contact with the countryside upon which the wealth and work of Chandigarh was built. It was from the essential joys of the village that Corbusier hoped to derive a primitive iconography for the city. Primitive in this context does not mean backward. Here we see a modernist conception of primitivity, one that differentiated Corbusier from Nehru and shaped the architect's work in Chandigarh. In the history of modernism, the word primitive doesn't refer to a real human or society. Rather, primitivity is an abstract idea, a theoretical construct through which modernism understands a particular relationship between human and nature. For the modernist, the adjective primitive describes a relationship between person and world that is unmediated by language and civilization, a pre-linguistic relationship with the earth. This primitive relationship of man to nature is privileged in modernism because theoretically it gives man access to an authentic nature, one that is denied to moderns because of their intensely machinic and mediated lives. Corbusier in particular sought out the primitive in India long and hard. In the September of 1961, he wrote to Nehru asking for a list of symbolic signs that he could use to represent the state. So, I mean, you can see here the signs that he picks are a tree, a serpent, this is, I think, wheat, and the zebu, the bull. He mentioned that he had already collected some signs dating from 100 or 1,000 years ago, and that from Nehru he hoped for signifiers of the contemporary social and political reality, which he planned to collage into a mural for the ceremonial entrance to the Assembly Hall. Nehru responded to this request, saying that he was much at sea as to what an iconography of resurgent India might be. A friend of the Prime Minister suggested the Ashoka Chakra as a symbol of the state, which is what you see right here, this guy. Saying that nothing came to mind that represented the aspirations of the peoples of India, that he could not completely comprehend what an iconography of radical politics and ethics might be. For Corbusier, the wonder of India lay not in its in the historical grandeur of its empires, of which the Ashoka Chakra was a product. It lay instead in the timelessness of rural tradition rather than the contingency of history. And the Ashoka Chakra is important here because one, it's on the Indian flag. Two, it signifies a Buddhist understanding of life, of dharma. Now, it's not just the Buddhist understanding of life, it is Ashoka spreading it. So the Ashoka Chakra has two opposite things in it. One is it has this way of life, but the other is it has the imperial spread of the Ashoka's empire. Anyway, so instead of the chakra, Cobb chose the wheel. Okay, so instead of so these are two other signs that come from in Indian history. And instead of the chakra, he puts the wheel of the bull. And the other sign, of course, that Corbusier chooses is the bull. The chakra becomes the wheel. Because the labor of the bull eschewed politics and history. The labor of the bull is apolitical, it is ahistorical, it is absolute. And he enshrined the horns of the bull into the parasol, and this is, of course, a story that we know. And here is that same chakra in the background on the ramp to the monument of the martyrs. This modernist opposition between tradition and history, the former as contextual and evolved, and the latter as imperial and imposed, also played out in the design of the rest of Chandigarh. Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew had fashioned themselves as experts of tropical architecture during their earlier work in Africa, and they presented themselves as perfectly suited to design in this particular climate. Of course, we know that Punjab is not tropical. It is just outside of the tropical zone, and it's actually hot and dry in the summers and cold and dry in the winters. And so which should signify to us that tropical architecture doesn't mean architecture of the tropics, but it means a certain approach to architecture. It's a certain idea. Tropical architecture was conceived of by modernists who were attempting to find a framework, an idea through which they could refract the conceptual substance of modernism so that it could enter and thrive in the third world. In tropical architecture, the timelessness of climate trumps the contingency of history. Instead of shielding the body from the sun, tropical architecture entered into an economy of climate, light, shade, wind circulation, and verandas. Architecture negotiated with climate to keep some things in and to keep some things out and let some things in. Of course, climatic response is deeply coded in India's scarcity. There was no money for electricity and air conditioning, and the reaction was to use form and material to achieve climatic control. So while Lachin's Delhi is a we have a map of it right here. So while Lachan's Delhi is the neoclassical collage of architectural styles found in the subcontinent across the past 2,500 years, Chandigarh is a collage of climactic responses from a similar time zone, found in the geography of the tropics. Lachan's dome of the Viceroy's Palace referenced the Sanchi Stupa, the same stupa that Hastings' Golghar referenced. And Chandigarh imported one of modernism's most famous elements of architecture, the brise-soleil, the sunbreaker, which lets in wind but keeps out the harshness of the sun. And the brise-soleil then, here's another brise-soleil, like the stupa that signified Indian history, came to signify the universal response of modernity, modernity's rational engagement to climate, and came to be replicated over and over again as a signal that here is an architectural element that has responded to its context. The brise-soleil then traveled throughout Punjab, especially in the newly built universities, where agriculture was being actively modernized through research and development. These universities were the site where that other crucial Western export was to be received. I'm referring to the transnational transfer of knowledge that brought in high-yield seeds with fertilizers and pesticides through the United States and the Rockefeller Foundation. These new seeds would lead to India's green revolution, making Punjab wealthy, into a sign of excess that all of India would aspire to be. The sunbreaker traveled to other cities through the work of modernists. Oh, here, so these are all images of the university, Punjab Agricultural University in Ludhiana. The sunbreaker traveled to other cities through the work of modernists like Aditya Prakash, Jeet Malhotra, Balkrishna B.V. Doshi, who all received their training in Nehru's Architecture School of India, that is Chandigarh. These campuses in the cities of Ludhiana and Hisar, which were the sites of modernizing agriculture, were also the sites where modern Indian architecture began to evolve. Of course, they were deeply influenced by Chandigarh, but they were also the beginning of architectural critiques of its modernisms. Aditya Prakash later said of the brise-soleil, and here is Aditya Prakash with one of the buildings that he designed. When we started designing houses, we thought of Western houses. We began using those sunbreakers in a very big way. It was very a la mode, but I did a study of the sun in Chandigarh and subsequently found that sunbreakers cut out the sun but retain the heat and the dust. We found it was better to create deep verandas. They keep out the rain and the sun, but allow life to move in and out as it has always done in an Indian house. But before you conclude that this is a critique of Corbusian modernism, note the key phrase at the end, as it has always done. While Prakash is ostensibly critiquing the sunbreaker, he has absorbed its language and is now using the alwaysness of climate to endorse the program of tropical architecture. And so while Jenner and his team of Indian architects labored away in the heat of Chandigarh, entering the economy and bureaucracy of its construction, Corbusier fantasized over the labor of the hand. He hand-painted the enamel ceremonial entrance door of the assembly hall. He also left impressions of his own hands in the concrete walls of his complex to mark his physical and unmediated, remember primitive, relationship with the city, embodying pre-linguistic contact, almost reaching out to touch that village that he had preserved in the background. The irony of this fetishization of the labor of the hand is that the hardest, most complicated, and tedious part of the project was that they were actually built by hand, by the labor of unskilled workers with minimal equipment. The city was the labor of agricultural peasants and partition refugees. Dam building dispossessed the former, and the latter were refugees from West Punjab, who during the traumatic violence of partition had left behind their land and traveled to India. These laborers carried concrete bucket by bucket up bamboo scaffoldings to pour them into shuttering to build both Chandigarh and the Bhakra Nangal. So this is the scaffolding of the Bhakra Nangal, yeah. And in Chandigarh, nonetheless, supervised not by Corbusier, but by his cousin, Pierre Jeanneret, It was Jeanere's labor in India on site which entered into the economy of skill, concrete bureaucracy, which actualized built forms onto the clean slate of Chandigarh and helped local contractors develop the skills and acquire the equipment of concrete technology in India that actually did the job of making the site modern. And I think this is a point that Maristela Casciato makes in her lecture on Jeanere. There was his labor that really entered into that economy of Chandigarh. All of this, the training of local architects, the development of concrete building skills, the transformation of agricultural labor to construction labor, and the development of the actual act of acquiring equipment. This is a list of all the equipment required for the Bhakra Dam, which I thought was quite interesting, was part of the plan of the state. The Indian Planning Commission, which had a series of public works projects lined up, needed a huge body of labor to see the work through. This body of laborers was wrought from agriculturalists, with the added advantage that they would leave, that the land they would leave would be consolidated into large land holdings better suited for modern agricultural methods. And so city and dam are tangled back into the agricultural economy, in that its peasantry built them, peasants who were the casualties of the state's widespread drive to consolidate and modernize agriculture. And so now, when we look back at Corbusier's open-hand monument, we can see how it got invested with meaning that Corbusier hadn't really intended it for it to have. He developed it in the years he traveled between France and India while thinking about the city of Chandigarh. Towards the end of the project, it became clear that since funding was scarce, the open hand would not be built. This was a great blow to Corbusier, who wrote to Nehru of the importance of the symbolism of the monument. He went so far as to argue that his open hand, that is a hand that both gives and receives, that welcomes new ideas and thoughts, also represented the Prime Minister's radical political idea of non-alignment, the idea from which we get the moniker Third World. Under the policy of non-alignment, the newly decolonized nations, argued Nehru, should not be forced to side with superpowers, no matter how scarce money and resources were. By banding together, they would align with neither the first world of capitalism nor the second world of communism. As the third world, they would remain politically independent and support each other. This identity of non-alignment had pronounced ramifications in India's international relations. In the early years of profound food scarcity, Eisenhower donated grain to Nehru's country in the hope of preventing it from turning red, given that widespread drought and famine and hunger might drive the nation to revolution and collapse the nation state. Later, this is after Nehru's death, Lyndon Johnson controlled food grain donations to India as retribution for their criticism of the role of the US in Vietnam. Here again, we see the tension between political imagination and bureaucratic decision-making play out. Nehru's state had at times privileged the former at the cost of food security, and perhaps this helps us understand Corbusier's choice to appeal to the specific political idea in the hope of garnering Nehru's support for his open-hand monument. However, scarcity was real, which is what Nehru conveyed to Corbusier. He wrote that given the meager resources of the country at the time, it was impossible to allocate financial and material resources to symbolic interventions. Now, what Nehru said was completely true. Scarcity was a huge problem in the early years of India's independence. Concrete, steel, food grains, chemicals, machinery, you name it, were all in short supply. More crippling than these was the shortage of foreign exchange, without which importing goods remained a difficult task. To manage these various scarcities and deficits, the Planning Commission created a quota system, rationing, where each state received a fixed amount of, say, for example, cement per economic year. As you can imagine, a project like Chandigarh monopolized the state's already scant resources. It received excess amid the scarcity all around it. And actually, Ravi Kalia quotes Nehru as justifying the excesses received by Chandigarh by saying, it is better to be extravagant than to be a person with no mind at all. And so Chandigarh, received excess amid the scarcity all around it, but not for the open hand. This constant tension between scarcity and excess plagued Punjab. What happened is that in comparison to other states, Punjab produced an excess of grain. It produced more grain than its population required. the central government laid claim to this excess grain, which was collected and redistributed to other states that were not able to meet their production requirements. From the point of view of Nehru's central government, this seemed fair, given the extensive irrigation, canalization, and damming in the region of the Indus, which had monopolized so much of the state's resources where others remained unaided. From the point of view of agriculturalists in the region, this seemed to be a great frustration, where their labor was drained away at fixed prices and cheap rates. Although this played out as a tussle between center and state, it was in reality one of the fundamental difficulties of social democracy, where the democratic state guarantees your right to private property and the socialist state lays claim to the grain that is reaped off of it. These were among the various political tensions that surfaced in the state, and Nehru became unable to manage them. In this atmosphere, constructing the open hand in Chandigarh was not possible, given Nehru's loss of support in the region. Here, an excess of food disrupted the fragile state, and scarcity became the excuse by which the open hand was relieved of its symbolic duty. In 1964, Nehru died, and in 1965, Corbusier, neither man seeing the monument built. In Punjab, tensions continued to rise, and in 1966, the state was further divided along linguistic lines into the three states of Punjab, Haryana, and Himachal Pradesh. While Himachal declared the hill station of Simla its new capital, Punjab and Haryana shared the city of Chandigarh. By the end of the decade, the agricultural situation in India changed drastically. Green Revolution seed was introduced into the country, and Punjab, being irrigated and containing infrastructure, benefited disproportionately from the modern techniques. Rather than quell anger, as Nehru had hoped, the public works had further exacerbated the feeling of inequality experienced by Punjabi farmers who developed a sectarian bend. In 1972, the central government, under the daughter of Nehru, Indira Gandhi, finally managed to secure funds and consolidate support for the nationalist symbols of her father, and the hand was finally built amid fervent debate about its lost meaning among architects. While its icons accrued history, Punjab itself descended into deep political tension, which emerged from a multitude of discontents, including that of ownership over the river waters and agricultural produce. This culminated in 1984, and I'm really glossing over a very complicated part of Punjabi history to get back to this conversation on architecture. In 1984, in a battle between the militant faction of secessionists and the Indian Army, when Indira Gandhi's government seized back control of the state, and this happened at Amritsar's Golden Temple. And here you can see the parallel between the governor making the claim that we promise to kill you if you don't leave your land, and here the military actually going in and killing people to reclaim Punjab from their control. Soon after, two of the Prime Minister's bodyguards assassinated Indira Gandhi in revenge. And in further retaliation, the city of Delhi, of course, where she lived, saw a horrific riot and the heedless slaughter of the Sikh community. Then what does the open hand mean? Where does this leave us in the relationship between food and architecture? Where scarcity and excess, both of them together, are able to destroy meaning so potently. How do we understand the relationship between architecture, infrastructure, and political economy, where the unintended consequences of architectural and public projects far exceed the imaginative capacity of the state? In an attempt to answer these difficult questions, I would say that built form is always called in to do work in excess of its program. The open hand, which is of course a truly flexible symbol, has gone on to represent not only India's attempt at somewhat radical politics, but also Corbusier's entire oeuvre. If Hastings' Golghar is poignant in that the absence of grain conveyed meaning in that situation, then Corbusier's hand is similar. I mean, there is only one open hand monument built in Chandigarh, but the image of the hand has proliferated and accrued exponential meaning. The Bhakra Dam also became a symbol. It stood in like a synecdoche for the public works project of the state and the state's greater commitment to its public, and in reverse of the people's sacrifice for their state. This synecdochic icon of progress and decolonization found itself on the stamp, and I've added the open hand monument just to help it complete its meaning, which is totally off scale, by the way. A stamp is not simply a symbol of circulation. It is an instrument that makes circulation possible. The stamp had the ability to traverse India much further than the grain, electricity, and water. All of these guys are right here. Electricity, water, grain, industry, resulting from the dam possibly ever reached. So the dam on the stamp, again, is finishing the work of the public works project. Similarly, the agricultural universities in Punjab signal the shift into a scientific register. The universities themselves did not modernize agriculture. They could not. They did not have the intellectual capital. They didn't have the resources. But they did the work of symbolizing the process and forming the sites that would then receive modernized agriculture when it did come through the Rockefeller Foundation and the labs of CIMM-YT in Mexico. And so we see that in the political economy of scarcity, architectural iconography is called in to finish the work that the program and institution are not able to do themselves. We see this disparity continuously in the architecture of modernity and of India's early years of independence. Architecture itself becomes a form of symbolic excess to the scarcity that fuels planning. Thank you.
Making of architecture, the buildings themselves, in scarcity. Corbusier had a free hand on the other side. All of the stuff that the rest of the architects and the team tried to struggle with, give real character, I think, to the architectural expression which grows out of your thesis.
Yeah. So of course, in this case, I was interested in seeing how scarcity shaped even Punjab, which actually is a sign of excess in all aspects. So it doesn't come in so much here. But I mean, when I think about scarcity in architecture, I think of one of the examples that you pointed to in your book, which is of Pragati Maidan, which was meant to be built in steel, of course, and could not be built in steel, and so ended up being built in concrete. I wish I had an image of it. It's this spectacular concrete frame built in the 80s, early 80s. So this scarcity lasted for a very long time. But I could also talk about some of the works built by the Public Works Department that I've seen in the archives. And there are just letters going back and forth saying, oh, this site is waiting, the engineer is coming from the United States, when is the foundation going to be laid? And then a reply from the Public Works Department saying, you haven't provided us with all the concrete that we need. And then the food department saying back that, oh, we're trying our best to get concrete from another side And the funny thing that I found about it that I've also been trying to combat is most of the examples of architecture or infrastructure, the important ones, tend to have the ability to divert resources to themselves. So I mean, I'm thinking, for example, a silo in Hapur. This is, it was actually built by, it was designed and produced by MS Butler, engineering in Kansas, and all they wanted is that India build the foundation. And it took ages. Those engineers who, it was a frustrating experience even reading the letters going back and forth in the archive. And I mean, I think that, of course, I think the point that you were also trying to make right now is that this scarcity gives a certain character to architecture. And so there is, of course, on one hand, the frustrations of it, but on the other hand, there is the program of tropical architecture, which then comes into modern architecture in India in a big way. And it becomes the drive, I mean, there's so much to say, I don't even know where to start with this, but it becomes the driving force of form. But at the same time, you know, I was reading about B.B. Doshi talking about how he knew that it was temporary, because at some point India would have access, and then this form would no longer be valid at all, and it would just disappear. It would have just been something that modernists responded to in this brief period of time. I don't know, I'm going to say more, but yeah.
Peter, 1 second. He was, please.
So this is quite a funny coincidence that today there was a huge demonstration in Montreal against austerity. And in these times of austerity, cuts, your conference, which is brilliantly semiotics and history of architecture, your conference raises a question that I want to ask you. Because there is a difference between the hand and the symbolic aspect of the dam, the
Bhakra,
yeah. Is that the hand is completely vain, it's for contemplation.
Yeah.
And so in these times of cuts and scarcity, there seems to be no room at all for poetic contemplation. And do you see that in architecture today?
I mean, the thing about the hand is that it wasn't built for the longest time. And I think, even in its absence, it was able to accrue meaning. In fact, its absence gave it this additional amount of meaning. And I think the same goes for the granary that I showed you in the beginning. It was empty, it's always been empty. And the emptiness is what gave it meaning. So I think, that we really need to think about how absence can add meaning to, or add the poetics of absence.
Yes.
I wonder if you could extend your answer to the first question by speaking about concrete. Because it seems both to be perhaps the material par excellence for expressing the primitive in modern architecture. In the example you gave in the 80s, it's the replacement because steel is expensive. But at the same point, it also seems to be, in certain periods, it's also 1930s Italy or 1950s India, it's also this luxury that's a limitation on a total modernization aesthetically of the state.
Chandigarh itself is this display of concrete, right? I mean, it puts concrete right at its surface. And then all of those imprints and everything, there were many, right? In the concrete themselves, they show how that material works. And then there's this, there's so much documentation of the process of building and putting it together that it's almost a museum of this new material, new for at least since the 1930s at least when it started. And in fact, the concrete companies probably have one of the better archives in India of the use of this material. So yeah, concrete is as much of the signifier here than as form.
Question?
Did you reach a conclusion as to if it would be worth it for the farmers to be displaced to build these grand architectures?
I think that, and I would really defer to all the people who have worked on scholarship on this, that at every point at which large ecological changes have been made, they change hierarchies to the extent that it becomes really hard to talk about before and after in any meaningful way. At each stage, with the canalization in the Punjab, there are, of course, critiques of it. And then it's not so much that land was infertile and now it is fertile, rather it is that a whole different set of people have access to infrastructure and water that didn't before. And it's the same with the Bhakra Dam, it changes that relationship. One entire set of people loses access and another set of people gains access. And so it becomes, again, the Green Revolution, farmers who had access to tube wells, to larger plots of land, to loans for money for tractors could benefit. And so each piece of technology itself differentiates who can benefit from it and not. And so, yeah, it becomes hard to quantify before and after, but you can kind of see how a technology itself filters its benefits through a group of people.
questions? Am I allowed?
Yes,
Oh, sorry, Bob, you have a question. Sorry.
I was just going to mention a book I've begun reading. It's a small book by, her name is Shiva, I forget her first name. And it's about the stolen harvest. And of course, it's not to do with architecture, but it's very much to do with agriculture and food. And she refers to this as a kind of a new form of colonialism, where it's not empires, but corporations.
Yeah.
And it's affecting very much the local economy, and it's introducing it again in a new way, the kind of decision on what will be grown and such new cash crops. So that
and of course, genetically modified, which is hard.
Which is kind of an architecture in itself.
Yeah.
Interior to biology instead.
I mean, the other side of that story is that she herself has started many very interesting movements to conserve seed and to conserve biodiversity. So I, in my work, tend to focus on the other side, not so much the production, but the distribution of food and the distribution networks. And that side has an equally kind of difficult story in terms of how the state is trying to create architectures of making people part of the system, and that leads to a whole series of exclusions in the process. And currently one of the biggest projects that India embarked on is doing these iris scans and biometrics, and giving everyone identity cards, and that really we need to see how that's going to play out in terms of who it excludes and who it includes, in terms of how technology puts these filters on people's access.
So this is kind of the latest wave of modernization, but at a much deeper level in a way.
Yeah, it is at a genetic level, right? Because it becomes a question of who owns what seed, how do you even, it's a very interesting field, copyrights, patents, everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any questions? I was thinking, because actually this now came after your lecture, which I really thank you very much, because it's opening also, coming for me, some new ideas. I thought very interesting, maybe you can say something more. You started with the background, the idea of agriculture and so on, and actually, I don't know how much, probably some of the people in the audience are familiar with that, but not all. You also put the Ludhiana Agriculture University as part, of this process. And I think that Ludhiana, and also connecting Ludhiana to some of the architects, from Chandigarh that moved there, like Prakash. It's this triangle of the dam as a modernization instrument, and then, but also, the effect, the output of it is education, not only providing food, but education in architecture. So, the project seems to me, in terms of politically, extremely, complex, more than just build. If you structure this thinking, you have the dam on one side, and then you put university, and then you Chandigarh. If you don't connect this different elements, you don't get the picture of the relevance of the project in Punjab. Am I going too far?
No, I agree. I definitely agree. And that's why I also felt like it would be interesting to talk about the story of architecture through the lens of food, because I feel like talking about Punjab is really, you need to talk about they call it the breadbasket of the country. And so, and because I think it is when you start to look at these networks of food and marketplace that you can begin to connect all the various projects. And there are many more than just even these three. These three are like the big ones that, well, at least Chandigarh and Bhakra are the big ones. But I definitely hope to do more work on connecting the smaller projects.
Comments? Yes, please.
What really floored me was that at the same time in Quebec, we were building the Manique, at the barrage Manique, okay, which is fundamental to this conception of having access to energy and changing things. And it became Hydro-Quebec. It was nationalized, and it began the whole concept of the Beijing's building barrage again and all that. And all this, how it reoccupies the territory and how we had to deal with the Indians up there, okay? And there was agreements and all that. And now as a contestation of all of a sudden, everything here is, we hear this tam-tam of being again Mohawk territory. Okay, so la théâtralité que vous avez expliqué of this symbolic whatever, I didn't quite get it all, but I thought it was quite interesting. They tried to have a catharsis of violence, okay, and then it worked, and then it didn't work, and all that. But anyway, and to top it all, we're having a big cemetery being built in Gaspésie. It's like we're right in the midst of still
dealing with
something that looks like that. I'm floored by it. And it's all coming back to having access to energy, be it oil, water, or whatever. But I mean, it's fascinating to see how much progress was made, and also was it progress? I mean, we had our concrete thing here, you know. Everybody remembers that one, and it's the roof isn't on it yet. And I mean, Jesus.
I think
are we progressing somewhere?
I think what you're also kind of outlining is how when the state actually visualizes itself and makes itself manifest through these public works projects, that creates the site on which people can identify themselves as citizens. You know, so now that there is this object, you can identify yourself as someone with a claim somewhere. That in this realm of theater of the state.
Yeah, because we're 4 days from an election, you know.
Yeah.
And the whole thing right now is getting a country. I mean, we have a country. I mean, it's amazing the shift that you were talking about of people having a different access to different things and creating a whole new ballpark.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, if we don't have more comments or remarks, I mean, I wish to thank you very much. Oh, Avika, please.
It's the same time when Chandigarh is being built. My family brings family home away from Chandigarh. My uncle is in Chandigarh at that time, so I go to Chandigarh too, so I know all the cities. That's the first time I learned what is cement. India never used cement in such a big way before that. You people are scholars of Chandigarh. Did native people, engineers, some people not ask these world leaders to look at local materials like lime?
Well, I mean, I let Ateya first answer. I have my own answer, Vika.
No, I mean, go ahead.
Well, I think that you are, I mean, once in my life, I think I have to disagree with you. This is not completely true. I mean, reinforced concrete construction, specifically in certain area of India, were quite developed. And actually, the people who built, I mean, the Chandigarh cement and reinforced. I mean, they're not coming from Punjab, they're coming from Mumbai and the area of Mumbai, where this industry was not only not unknown, but very much used by the British administration already. So it's not totally true, in my opinion, that there is no knowledge of that material. But Chandigarh, this was a question I was probably asking later to Ateya. I mean, we identify the city with the symbol of the capital, and within the capital, the symbol of the open hand that has, I mean, built much later and so on. So this is also this shift in building. It's something interesting. But the city is not the capital. You cannot, I mean, go to this Cinedosh. Chandigarh is the capital, because, I mean, you make a big, I mean, I would make a big mistake. I mean, Paris is the Tour Eiffel, but Chandigarh is not the capital. Chandigarh is the city of the urban structure, is the city of the brick, is the city where the schools are inventing, Pierre Jeanneret, new technique with local material. So if I do this, I transfer this, I mean, I go to the Chandigarh and I look at the capital and I talk about the symbolic value of the beton brut. I think I only understand one sector of that endeavor. And Corbu is giving his signature for one, but there are others that are giving signature to other aspects of the building process. Also very traditional, with the brick down there next to the building. So, I mean, these two poles, I think they are equally interesting in this specific examples. And maybe this is not the only one, but I mean, at least this is the way I read, the capital complex vis-a-vis the city urban fabric. I don't know, this whole industry, it's not totally unknown. Otherwise, of course I know, look at the images also in the Œuvre Complète, how they are really working with the hands also to prepare the iron structure. Because you don't have all the machine that prepares all the roads and so on. You have to do a lot, manually also there. But there is a certain, skills and technique which sometimes needs to be, put in, be emphasized. And also, I think that there was a good knowledge of using of the steel building. Again, in Mumbai, there are some good examples of architectural iron and steel and frame, which are, much before Chandigarh. I can think of some examples. I don't know. I think that the way how reinforced concrete is used, it has also a meaning of political and so on, and it's the other way of thinking of scarcity. It's the excess in a way. But I don't know. This is what I have learned in studying a bit the building industry.
I think also because concrete had the ability, like you needed concrete to build dams, and so it had a certain ability to signify being modern. That local materials, of course, now local materials have their own set of significations that we can look at. Like they reference the fact that you are being sustainable, that you're so they have their own ideology that comes with them. Because the other thing is that, of course, there was some amount of cement produced in India, but again, one of the narratives of scarcity that happened is that India lost so much of its cement production to Pakistan in partition. And then there are these really interesting experiments being done in the laboratories, in the science and research laboratories, to find alternatives for cement. So there's all this like puzzolana, how much puzzolana can be mixed into cement so that we can get the same strength without actually having to buy cement and spend foreign exchange on it. And so, yes, cement is certainly not an absolutely local material, but I think it was such an important signifier of modernity, I think, which is also what Peter was referencing, that I can imagine that I don't know, maybe need to speak to more people who actually encountered it at that point, but that it signified everything changing. It signified change.